Hello, thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Creating and Measuring Culture Change. My name is Lucy and with me is Missy, and we'll start off by giving us a little bit of information about ourselves and about our company, Willing Observers. So as I mentioned, my name is Lucy. I have over 10 years of experience in the DEI industry and 11 years of experience in thinking about culture and actually implementing culture change across organizations. I have consulted with various organizations since 2014 to work on improving their DEI issues with employee engagement, with team management, and customer service experiences. I currently also manage a national DEI and D&I benchmarking survey for companies that have over 500 employees. And like Missy, I'm a regular speaker in diversity, equity, and inclusion circuits. And my areas of specialty include DEI benchmarks, culture, bias and racism, and whiteness. Previously, I was faculty in the Department of Anthropology at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. So I am a trained anthropologist, and you'll hear more about what that means for our company. And I have published widely about diversity and the diversity and inclusion industry in academic journals and in opinion editorials. And currently, I would like to say I am working on my book on the culture of diversity expertise in corporate America, but we've been very busy at Willing Observers. So it is aspirational for sure. I'll turn it over to you, Missy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Missy. I have 15 years experience in doing work with cultural inquiry, which will, as Lucy said, we'll explain a little bit more about what that means too. And 17 years or so of experience in working with individuals and organizations on DEI issues. I've consulted with a lot of domestic and international organizations. My area of focus has been largely on public education initiatives and advocacy campaigns around promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm a regular public speaker as well, and I do a lot of work with opinion writing and some academic writing. My areas of focus tend to be on language and social justice, gender inclusivity, and public policy. But Lucy and I overlap in working on things like DEI benchmarks, culture, and whiteness. I'm a faculty member at California State University, Long Beach in California. Currently, I teach a few classes there each semester as well. I'm in the anthropology department, as well as the linguistics department and the gender studies department. And I am also aspirationally working on my book, which is about political participation and conflict resolution. So let me tell you a little bit about the company as well. So Willing Observers, Lucy and I have co-founded this company. The company provides comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion services from a grounds up approach. And we conduct cultural assessments using a holistic and iterative consulting process and from an anthropological perspective, because Lucy and I are both trained anthropologists. So what we look to do is, we'll talk a little bit more about this, is start from cultural assessment and then work to integrate DEI throughout the organization by creating a robust accountability framework and by focusing heavily on metrics. And the metrics focus on both leadership and staff because it is holistic. We also host DEI trainings, we host events, and we have a community platform. Our website is here, www.willingobservers.com, if you want to learn more or join our community.
So over the remaining 40 minutes or so, we're going to be walking you through what is culture and what does it look like in organizations, and what is our Willing Observers culture inquiry approach and what it looks like when you are integrated into DEI. And lastly, we're going to show you specifically what that means with our culture change process, which we've outlined into 5 steps that anyone can do to begin culture change at their organization.
So we'll start with the baseline first, and that is, what is culture exactly? So culture is a way of characterizing a set of beliefs, values, ideas, practices, norms, and behaviors that holistically constitute a group's way of being and worldview. That means culture has a number of components. So culture is patterned, learned, symbolic, dynamic, and heterogeneous. And let me take each of those one by one. When we say culture is patterned, that means that a specific set of beliefs, values, or ideas will drive practices, norms, and behaviors across different areas of our life. So, for instance, if we think of gender, if we think of this kind of trope that masculine means something bigger and stronger, and feminine becomes associated with something smaller and weaker, then we can see that patterning, right? The influence of that belief maps onto a bunch of different areas of our life, valued leadership models, bigger and stronger, smaller and weaker, right? Those are often gendered. But we can think of things like labor access, ways of speaking, expectations for emotional behaviors, clothing design, the architecture of spaces, expectation for athletics. So it's not just one way, right? Pattern means it happens and drives behaviors, practices, norms across different areas of our life. So culture is also learned. This means that we're not born with a culture, but we're socialized into being a member of that culture. So, certain kinds of beliefs, practices, and behaviors that you learn, you also internalize, and you come to see them as normal or inherently good, or even a human universal, sometimes as necessary for belonging. And that is true even if they don't represent the full range of human experience. So, culture is learned. Culture is also symbolic. A symbol is something that stands for something else. Culture can be expressed through things and actions that are then thought to represent or mark expressions of or membership in a particular cultural group. So, displaying a flag, speaking a certain language, wearing specific articles of clothing, even sitting at your desk in a certain way can be seen as a symbolic marker of cultural membership. So, culture is also dynamic. That means cultures are neither fixed nor are they bound. And the elements that are thought to make up a culture, they can change over time, they can adapt to new circumstances, they can shift from place to place and person to person. That means that they are also heterogeneous. So, culture is heterogeneous. That means that it has a lot of different kinds of, we'd say, iterations or elements. So, even though a lot of people try to pinpoint a fixed set of elements that make a real culture or an authentic culture, variation always exists within any cultural system because any culture can encompass many, many ways of being, even those ways of being that might seem contradictory. So now that we have kind of a sense of what culture is, what is cultural inquiry? The cultural inquiry model allows us to use these understandings of culture and the elements that make up culture to take a closer look at the cultures of organizations and workplaces. What this allows us to do then is to understand how every minute action and interaction is shaped by broader social forces, patterns, histories, and legacies. And it allows us to recognize these everyday beliefs and values and practices as part of constituting one culture. This recognition allows us to better identify the ways to act to create concrete and sustainable change within our organizations and our workplaces. So, the other aspect that we're going to be talking about then is, what is culture? What is cultural inquiry? And how does that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is probably part of why you're here today. But first, let's think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The acronym DEI gets thrown around quite a bit. So, what does it mean? Diversity, equity, and inclusion are distinct terms with distinct meanings. Although they are clearly related terms, understanding the distinctions between them can help us more critically assess our actions and interactions and help us to set more targeted goals for changing our practices. So diversity characterizes meaningful differences between people. This is context specific. While there are often historical constants that structure the ways that diversity is absent from powerful spaces, to diversify a group or organization in a meaningful way may vary from group to group, from organization to organization, from time to time, and from place to place. Equity. Equity is important to understand because it's not the same as equality. Equity represents values and practices that aim to address the needs of individuals to ensure well-being across a group of people. So here I am going to steal a story from Lucy that she tells about Band-Aids. I think it's highly instructive. So imagine a teacher, right, working with young children. Early in the school year, one child gets a cut and asks for a Band-Aid. The teacher puts a Band-Aid on all of the children in the classroom. The children then ask, why are we all getting Band-Aids when only one child was hurt and needed a Band-Aid, right? They don't need Band-Aids, not everyone needs them. Now, that is a great lesson in the difference between equality and equity. Equality, where everyone gets the same thing, and equity, where people get what they need to ensure well-being, even though that might be different things. Inclusion is the last term here. Inclusion, a sense of belonging in a particular space or among a particular group of people. Belonging, feeling included, might mean different things to different people or different groups of people. So this might include feeling valued, respected, supported, or empowered.
So when we think about blending in, what does the cultural inquiry model look like in terms of DEI? We're thinking very specific things. The first thing we're going to talk about is how culture shapes 4 key levels that we investigate at Willing Observers. So the first one is how culture shapes societies. So when it comes to societies, we're thinking about normative practices, rules, ideals that formally and informally structure larger institutions and systems, and which impact everyone differently across race, gender, ability, etc. So one example one example to give you that shows how culture shapes us on a societal level is our prison system. In the United States, we incarcerate people, the amount of time we give people for committing crimes and how they are incarcerated is very much driven by cultural beliefs, ideas, rules, laws, etc. So for example, and that these impact differently people across race, gender, and ability. And this is different than, say, how people are incarcerated in places like Norway and Sweden, where if you've looked at photos of prisons in Norway, they look very much like college dorm rooms. So, and the second one is organization. So culture also impacts organizations differently, and organizational cultures vary from place to place. We consider each organization to have their own workplace norms, beliefs, practices, and to shape how stakeholders do their formal and informal roles. You might notice there's differences across different workplaces if you held more than one job. So to give you an example, offices in Silicon Valley in California are known to have a very casual and quote unquote relaxed culture where people can show up in jeans and sweatpants and hoodies and not be judged for the wardrobe they are wearing. Traditionally, and in more traditional corporate organizations, people might be expected to wear business suits and a tie. And certainly that debate between the hoodie and a business suit was really popular in 2011 and 2012 when, 2012, when Facebook was becoming a public corporation. The third level we look at is relational. So how does culture influence our relations between people, between organizations, between people and organizations, and technologies, and between people, technologies, organizations, and technology? How do they all relate and interact with each other? So our culture, as Missy explained, our beliefs, our norms, our values, our practices shape how we relate to other people, things, and organizations. One example you can think about is how people have different relationships to technology. Some people may be PC users, and some people may be exclusively Mac users. And if you've ever talked to someone who is the opposite of you, you can see that they are driven by different kinds of values. For instance, a Mac user like myself, I might say, well, I don't like to worry about viruses. I like things to be really simple and neat and organized, and everything to sync between my phone, my watch, and my computer, my desktop, my PC. A PC user, and there are certainly PC users in my family, would advocate that they value and appreciate their ability to game in different systems, their ability to customize their hard drives, and etc. So our culture and our values, our beliefs, etc., shape how we relate, not just to people, and certainly we can talk about different ways that humans relate to each other, but also how we relate to objects. And lastly, culture shapes our personal dimensions, our individual sense of self and our identity, including our personal beliefs, values, and practices. And these also change across time and across space. So all of these levels actually change across time and space. And you might think about how our histories, our ancestries, and our legacies shape our personal beliefs and our personal values. So we might think about how our family that migrated from another country, their values have shaped us on an individual level. But we can also think about how our institutions and our organizations in the United States have been shaped by specific kinds of histories and legacies, as well as our societies in general. So all of these levels are shaped by time, but not just in terms of history, but also in terms of the future, and in terms of what we aspire to be and what we imagine our future to be like. So for instance, in our society, our equal employment opportunity laws, those are something that are shaped by our visions of the future, of what we want a place to look like that we work in and that we live in. And so do our DEI practices. They are also shaped by both the past and the future. The second dimension that we consider across all these levels is space, is how are all these forms of relating, these beliefs, practices, and norms across all these levels, how do they change across space? So this can refer to how we move around empty space, whether it is in our homes or out in the street, in a foreign country, or in our neighborhood, and how we move in relation to built environments. And these kinds of built environments, for instance, are very important for people with disabilities, or from people with just have different abilities, from and even kids to more senior individuals, and how they engage with architecture, and even where furniture is positioned. So for example, when I was a faculty member, I always gave this example in terms of where I put my desk shapes the kinds of relationships I have with my students. If I put my desk in the middle of the room, students tend to sit or stand at least 6 feet away from me. And that creates a different kind of relationship between us, of more formal, professional, more detached. Versus if I put my desk against the wall, students come closer to me and they might pull up a chair and sit 6 inches away from me. And that creates a different kind of relationship. I personally prefer the desk in the middle of my room because I like some distance from my students, but other faculty members might appreciate having their desk against the wall so that they can develop a different kind of trusting and confidence type relationship with their students just by how close they are when they interact with them. So our cultural inquiry model, you might be wondering, how does that then relate to DEI? So if we're looking at our organizational culture through DEI, that means that we need to know some specific things. The first one is we need to know that our institutions historically create harm and exclusion across race, gender, and ability, because these are the institutions we have inherited. That means that everyday cultural processes like norms, practices, values, and beliefs reinforce inequality because that has been historically the trajectory we have been in for centuries. And that lastly, it takes a critical mass amount of people willing and committed to changing systems so that we can create systems that support everyone. And we can use the cultural inquiry model to create diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture change. But if we do this, that means we have to have concrete DEI related goals. That means that, so we have outlined three broad goals. So the first goal that we aspire to, and we have when we do cultural assessments and when we suggest new recommendations for strategies, is creating new communication norms and practices and challenging slash expanding what is considered acceptable behavior. So through our assessment, we look at what behaviors do people actually do, what ideas and practices do they have, and why are those considered acceptable and not others? And then we go from that starting point to flex and expand the range of potential behaviors so that they can be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Second, we look at restructuring organizational formal processes to ensure that people have equitable access to opportunities in the workplace. So that means actually looking at hiring process review processes and other kinds of formal procedures so that we are making sure that we have representation in the pipeline and we have representation in different spaces and people can have different access and equitable access, or people can have similar kinds of access to those opportunities in the workplace. Lastly, that means we approach culture change from an inclusive, grounds up perspective that intentionally includes as many people as possible in cultural assessment and vision building. Now, we didn't get to talk about vision building, but that's certainly one of the other services that we incorporate as part of our cultural assessment. But our goals with these, with the cultural assessment and the vision building sessions is that we interview a representative number of individuals at a company and we do focus groups and we invite them to build, to imagine what it would be like to work in an ideal workplace that is diverse and inclusive. And we think about a strategy both in terms of what has happened on the past, which is the interview and focus group emphasis, and where do we want to be, which is our vision building emphasis, and think of those as part of the same cultural assessment.
So we'll transition now to thinking about the on our agenda, how can we think about this as a 5-step process to creating culture change? So we're going to work through 5 steps. The 5 steps that we're going to outline for you today are ones that Lucy has alluded to in talking through the model. 1, understanding current culture as the first step in the process. 2, creating value-related goals or value goals as the second step. 3, setting behavioral expectations. 4, creating accountability. And 5, measuring change. So we're going to go through these one by one, and we're going to look at a specific example and how we can apply this step by step. So step 1 of 5, understanding current culture. Now, what is culture again? Culture is a way of characterizing a set of beliefs, values, ideas, practices, norms, and behaviors that holistically constitute a group's way of being and worldview. So we can understand the current culture of an organization by looking first at what people say and where do we kind of get what people are saying. So here, this is what Lucy was referring to in thinking about interviews and focus groups. So interviews and focus groups, people will report on certain kinds of information like we have here. right? Some people may express, and I'll read these as quotes, quote, I feel like everyone just goes with what my manager says. I don't feel comfortable expressing my opinion, end quote. We get another quote, quote, I knew that meeting with our client was going to go poorly, but when I suggested we take a different approach, I was quickly shut down, end quote. Through interviews and focus groups, you might get this sentiment, quote, it seems like everyone knows who the people who speak out are because they are mocked in private, end quote. All right. So this is, right, these kinds of statements can show us a potential pattern. And a potential pattern can lead into an opportunity area for both understanding the current culture and creating culture change. But what people say, right, what people report, even when patterns emerge, is more reliable if you can also observe what people are doing within their organization to see how that matches up with what people are saying. So, here, through observations, you might see very quiet team meetings, uh, consistent agreement, and consistent agreement is a really interesting thing here because, consistent agreement might be something that you think is something to strive for. And while it might be, if it's taken in this kind of holistic context, you can see that it might be indicative of a problem area rather than something that is being done well within the organization. A third observation you might see, employees looking around to their peers, searching for the correct answer. So, with kind of bringing together what people are saying or what they're reporting in interviews and focus groups, combined with what we can observe actually happening in an organization, we can arrive at certain kinds of findings. In this case, we could probably, right, reasonably assume here that people within this organization do not feel comfortable expressing differences in opinion. So, what is the next step? Okay, so step 2 of 5 is creating value goals. Why values? So, values are an important guiding force in constituting a group's worldview. If you want to impact or change the culture of an organization, pinpointing values and knowing how to make them actionable is a really important place to focus. So, if we go back to the finding that we just looked at, that quote, people within this organization do not feel comfortable expressing differences in opinion, end quote, we can identify some values that we would like to see implemented that relate to that finding. So, if we really do want people to feel comfortable expressing differences of opinion, maybe this is because we want to value diversity of thought. It might also be because we want to value respect, right? Respect for everyone, respect for their voices, respect for their contributions. So, this is a note that these values can stand on their own or they can reinforce one another. But these are some of the values that an organization might either aspire to or aspire to do well that might not be in line with what is currently happening in terms of the culture of the organization itself.
Now, the third thing to do now that you've had values or you have values is to create and set behavioral expectations. And I will say here that it is common, and this often happens with our consulting at Willing Observers, that we see that companies have values articulated on their company websites. But then when they do the observations and do the interviews, they find that they're not actually living up to those values. So the practices do not match what they claim to value to themselves and to the public. So whether you are creating new values out of these findings or whether you just want to reinforce the values that you have articulated, regardless of whether that may be, you have to set behavioral expectations. Now, to set behavioral expectations, you need to identify concrete practices you want to change that tie back to your findings. They have to be measurable so you can change them over time and across space. So for example, if we use the example that Missy just gave us with diversity of thought, if your company has this diversity of thought, or whether they want to have diversity of thought as a value, they might expect to have the following practices: more discussion in meetings, more confidence in voicing dissenting opinions, and more avenues or ways for people to provide input. Now, these can be aspirational. So you can think about, what practices would I expect to see if my company truly value diversity of thought? And they can be these three. It could be additional ones that we did not mention. But the point is that if these behavioral expectations have to, at least in part, exemplify a value being enacted. And we can walk you through what that means. So to set behavioral expectations for more discussions in meetings, you might consider doing more management training and facilitation skills. So to actually training your management to know and how to do facilitation and do it well. You might consider providing handouts with best practices on how to address conflict in meetings. You might also consider instituting a habit of executive leaders asking in large team meetings, what do you think? And you might consider providing an agenda and presentation notes ahead of the meeting to encourage individuals to prepare for discussion. Again, it could include these things or be additional ones that you consider appropriate. The second one is, in order to create more avenues for people to provide input, you might consider doing an anonymous comment or suggestion box for each manager or for the office. You might also consider looking into potentially using collaborative tools to work on projects together, such as online word processors. And what this would do is, instead of every individual taking up a project and just doing it themselves and then sharing it with someone else, it might encourage people to brainstorm and think about ideas and encourage confidence and motivate individuals to voice their opinions. And lastly, you could consider soliciting feedback through various mediums to encourage oral, written, or visual communication. So for instance, now that we have been virtual, and different people have been virtual for different amounts of time, we have found that online platforms such as Slack allow employees and staff and managers to communicate with emojis. But that in itself is not enough. As you probably already guessed, if you make it everyone's responsibility to do culture change, then it's likely no one will actually do culture change. So the first thing you want to consider is assigning responsibility, then assigning to specific individuals, then assigning those individuals certain tasks, creating specific deadlines, and having venues or avenues for individuals to report the completion of those tasks. And I'll walk you through a few examples. So for example, let's say we go back, we think it's really important for our managers to know how to facilitate meetings well in order to live up to the value of diversity of thought. So you might consider asking DEI personnel to compile best practices on facilitation skills. You might consider giving that person a deadline of March 2022, but in order for them to actually do it, they should report those best practices and the completion of this task to the person likely to be their manager, which is the Chief Diversity Officer. And this is certainly how responsibility and accountability is created in an organization that has a diversity department or that has a top-down hierarchy for the diversity and inclusion efforts. However, if you wanted to create and we suggest, if we really wanted to create long-term sustainable change, you have to incorporate more people than just the diversity department. So one of those sets of people are your executives. So let's say the executive's responsibility, you ask them to regularly solicit feedback in meetings, and they should do this every month. But But oftentimes we ask ourselves, well, how do we ensure that executives are actually doing this work of asking feedback from meetings. And this is where having a DEI committee might be useful, because then you could have a DEI committee where that addresses and looks over and reviews the goals and the tasks of executive members. And so that executives have somewhere to discuss any issues they have with their tasks. So for example, they might say, well, asking that question, do you have any feedback at the end of the meeting, isn't very productive, because I find people just want to leave the meeting. They don't want to actually voice their opinion. So then the DEI committee could go back to the DEI personnel and say, can we come up with more strategies or things that people can do? Then they can take it back to the committee, which takes it back to those executives. And you can think about this as the iterative process, right? So that things can always be adapted and changed as long as there's some there's accountability set in for change. And the last one is, let's say you're ready to implement this other task that contributes to diversity of thought as a value, but more formally. So you might consider having managers take a facilitation skills course and take a test where they have to prove that they passed it with 75% or more as their final grade. And you want all managers to do this by June 22nd. And the person who they would be reporting to is the director. And then the director would communicate those goals to those that are in charge of overviewing and reviewing the new tasks and responsibilities for creating concrete culture change. So as you can see, just when it comes to one value, when you break it down in specific behavioral expectations, you can assign specific individuals with responsibility to live up to those expectations and implement these new behaviors. But these have to have deadlines, and there has to be a person or an avenue to which these tasks are reported as completed. But you might be wondering here, well, how do we incentivize executives to make these changes or managers to make these changes? And so, of course, you need to have buy-in from executives to make this change. That's not a question. But there's also many different ways to do incentives. We have heard, for example, that executives are incentivized by being offered financial bonuses. But another way that we quote unquote incentivize through our accountability is by revisiting and reviewing review processes like performance reviews. So these could be quarterly, yearly, or other periodic performance reviews of managers. And in order to ensure that these behavioral practices are actually being enacted, you might consider identifying questions or behavioral expectations to measure in these performance reviews. So one example here, when it comes to this skill, let's say we wanted managers to become more better at facilitating meetings, could be providing a question like, on a scale 1 to 10, how skilled is your manager in soliciting and considering feedback, and provide an example. And you can think about these reviews either as peers reviewing each other, so managers reviewing each other, or direct reports reviewing their managers in 360 reviews. Other ways that you can track change include doing scorecards and dashboards. So if you do not know what a scorecard is when it comes to DEI, I welcome to look into it. But essentially, you're doing this task of assigning, taking a goal, breaking it up into a task, assigning responsibility, and putting deadlines and measuring that. So you can take all the tasks that you just saw in the last page and put it and organize it in a scorecard so that you can see it in a dashboard and you can track it quarterly, yearly. You can look at how effective the change practices have been. Second, you can track change in DEI committee meetings. So people were to create a culture of people being accountable to each other. So if you have a committee meeting where executives are involved and managers are involved, directors are involved, you can think of those individuals as being the point people for their kind of different roles or departments, et cetera, and where they can meet together and discuss the progress that they have done and discuss any more opportunities for growth. And you can also track change through surveys. So this is a really popular way now. There's tons and tons of surveys on that claim to do diversity, equity, and inclusion tracking. And you can certainly, that is certainly a good step to analyze and to create accountability, but it's just one way to do it. A truly comprehensive DEI accountability process is going to integrate as many of these elements as possible. And we only covered one value. So we only talked about doing behavioral expectations and creating accountability for one value, but you might think about doing them for all your values. And of course, that is going to take time and work, but most importantly, the participation of as many people as possible in your organization.
So to sum up, right, creating culture change is what we were targeting today. And we explained a little bit about the cultural inquiry model and what it does for us. So the cultural inquiry model allows us to truly understand a culture to create locally meaningful culture change and here within your organization. So we apply a DEI lens to identify the issues that limit representation, that create inequities, and that reproduce exclusion. We use values strategically, whether those are the values that your company already articulates, but might want to do a little bit more work on living up to those values, or whether those are the values that your organization is creating. But we use those values strategically to identify opportunities for change, as well as concrete behavioral suggestions that help us live up to these values. Without those kinds of concrete behavioral expectations attached to them, then as we tried to articulate too, there's a distinction between words and practice, right? Between what people say and what people do, and we're trying to align those as well. And third, we tie these new expectations into organizational metrics to identify whether behaviors are actually changing, because it's very important to actually track those changes and to think about this over time as something that is a process that you may need to return to over and over again in order to create the kind of organization that you imagine that you want to be in, and the kind of societies that you imagine that you want to be in that are as diverse and equitable and inclusive as possible. So thank you for being with us today to talk about creating and measuring culture change. We appreciate your time and attention. My name is Missy, and I'll turn it over to Lucy to bring us to a close.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really hope that this short webinar was insightful and instructive. And we appreciate you sticking with us for the last 40, 45 minutes or so. And we also hope that this can help you get started on creating culture change. And we are here available if you need us. Thank you.